Margaret Thompson sat quietly in the corner of the crowded coffee shop, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. At 78 years old, she had grown accustomed to being overlooked, invisible in a world that seemed to value youth above all else. The small bronze medal pinned to her worn cardigan caught the afternoon light, its surface dulled by decades of wear but still bearing the faint outline of military insignia. "Look at that old lady," whispered Jessica, a 20-something marketing executive at the table nearby. "She's wearing some kind of fake military medal. Probably bought it at a thrift store to get attention." Her companion, Brad, chuckled quietly. "People do weird things when they get old. My grandmother used to tell stories about meeting celebrities that never happened. It's like they live in Fantasyland." Margaret's hearing wasn't what it used to be, but she caught enough of their conversation to understand the nature of their comments. She had heard similar whispers countless times over the years. The medal on her chest wasn't shiny like the ones displayed in military museums. It didn't command respect the way modern decorations did. To most people, it looked like nothing more than an old piece of metal that belonged in a jewelry box or garage sale. The coffee shop buzzed with the typical afternoon crowd. Business people tapped away on laptops, students hunched over textbooks, and friends caught up over lattes and pastries. Margaret had chosen this particular spot because it was quiet, away from the main flow of foot traffic. She came here 3 times a week, always ordering the same Earl Grey tea and sitting at the same small table by the window. "I bet she tells people she was in the war," Jessica continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "These attention seekers always have some dramatic backstory. Next thing you know, she'll be claiming she saved lives or something ridiculous like that." Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, her fingers tracing the edge of the medal absently. She had stopped trying to explain its significance years ago. People saw an elderly woman in outdated clothing and made their assumptions. They saw the tarnished bronze and assumed it was worthless. They couldn't possibly imagine the weight of history it carried, the memories it held, or the price that had been paid for it. The medal had been awarded to her in 1967, during a time when women in military service faced skepticism and discrimination on a daily basis. Back then, female medics were often treated as novelties rather than serious medical professionals. Margaret had endured countless comments about whether women belonged on the battlefield, whether they could handle the pressure, whether they had the strength to carry wounded soldiers to safety. She remembered the day she received the medal with crystal clarity. The ceremony had been small, attended by only a handful of officers and fellow medics. No fanfare, no media coverage, no crowds of grateful families. Just a brief acknowledgement of her actions during a particularly brutal engagement where she had repeatedly entered hostile territory to evacuate wounded soldiers. 3 separate trips under enemy fire, each time dragging a wounded comrade to safety while bullets whistled overhead. The citation read simply, "For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty under fire." But those few words couldn't capture the terror she had felt, the adrenaline that had pushed her forward when every instinct screamed at her to take cover. They couldn't describe the weight of a dying soldier in her arms or the desperate prayers she had whispered as she ran through smoke and chaos. "Excuse me, miss," came a voice from behind her. Margaret turned to see a young barista, probably no older than 20, standing with a concerned expression. "I couldn't help but notice some customers were bothering you. If they're making you uncomfortable, I can ask them to keep their voices down." Margaret smiled gently at the young man. His name tag read Kevin, and his genuine concern was refreshing in contrast to the mockery she had just endured. "Thank you, dear, but it's quite all right. I've heard worse." Kevin glanced over at Jessica and Brad's table, then back at Margaret. "Is that a real military medal? It looks really old." "It is old," Margaret replied simply. "Almost 60 years now. Wow, that's incredible. My grandfather served in Vietnam, but he never talked about it much." "Did you serve too?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I was a medic. Spent 2 tours in Vietnam between 1965 and 1968. Kevin's eyes widened. "Really? That's amazing. I've never met a female Vietnam veteran before. What was it like?" Before Margaret could answer, Jessica's voice cut across the coffee shop, loud enough for several nearby tables to hear.
Kevin, don't encourage her. She's obviously making things up. Women weren't even allowed in combat roles back then. That medal is probably from a costume shop.
Margaret felt her cheeks flush, not from embarrassment but from a familiar frustration. This wasn't the first time her service had been questioned, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The erasure of women's military contributions was something she had fought against her entire life, long after her active duty had ended.
Kevin looked between Margaret and Jessica, uncertainty flickering across his face.
Margaret could see him weighing the words of a well-dressed young professional against those of an elderly woman whose appearance suggested modest means. It was a calculation she had seen countless times before. "I understand your skepticism," Margaret said calmly, addressing Jessica directly. "Many people don't realize that women served as medics, nurses, and in various support roles during Vietnam. We weren't in official combat positions, but the enemy didn't make that distinction when they were shooting at us."
Jessica rolled her eyes. "Right, and I suppose you single-handedly won the war too. Come on, lady, we weren't born yesterday. If you really had some heroic military career, don't you think you'd be living somewhere nicer than wherever it is you came from?"
The assumption stung more than Margaret cared to admit. Her modest apartment and well-worn clothing were the result of decades of working-class jobs after her military service. Unlike many of her male counterparts, she hadn't received the same recognition, benefits, or opportunities upon returning home. Female veterans often found their service minimized or forgotten entirely, their struggles dismissed as less significant than those of their male colleagues.
"Military service doesn't guarantee financial success," Margaret replied evenly. "And heroism isn't measured by bank account balances." Brad leaned forward, emboldened by his companion's hostility. "Look, we're not trying to be mean, but you have to admit this is pretty hard to believe. That medal doesn't even look official. And if you really did something worthy of military recognition, wouldn't there be records? Documentation? Something more substantial than just your word?"
Margaret reached into her small purse and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but still legible. She unfolded it carefully and placed it on the table where Kevin could see. It was her discharge papers, complete with commendations and service record. Kevin studied the document, his expression growing more respectful with each line he read.
"This is real," he said quietly.
"It lists her as a field medic with the 312th Evacuation Hospital.
And look at these commendations."
Jessica snatched the papers from Kevin's hands before he could finish reading. Her confident smirk faltered as she scanned the official military letterhead and formal language.
The document was clearly authentic, complete with official seals and signatures.
"Anyone can fake papers," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "These could be photocopies of someone else's documents." Margaret remained silent as Jessica examined the papers more closely. She had stopped trying to prove her worth to skeptics long ago. Those who wanted to believe would find ways to doubt, regardless of evidence presented. But she couldn't deny feeling a small spark of satisfaction as she watched Jessica's certainty crumble. The coffee shop had grown quieter, with several nearby customers now paying attention to the unfolding drama.
Margaret could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others sympathetic.
She had never wanted to be the center of attention, had never sought recognition or praise for her service. All she had ever wanted was simple acknowledgement that her contributions mattered, that her sacrifices had meaning. "This address is local," Jessica said, pointing to a line on the discharge papers.
"If this is real, then you grew up here?" Margaret nodded. "Born and raised. Graduated from Central High School in 1964, enlisted 6 months later.
I came back after my service and never left."
"But why?" Brad asked, genuine confusion in his voice.
"I mean, if you were really some kind of war hero, why stay in a small town?
Why not capitalize on that? Write a book, give speeches, do something with your story?"
The question revealed more about Brad's worldview than he probably realized. Margaret had encountered this perspective many times before, the assumption that military service was somehow transactional, something to be leveraged for personal gain rather than a duty performed out of love for country and fellow citizens. "Not everyone serves for recognition," Margaret said simply. "Some of us just did our jobs and came home to live our lives."
The medal isn't for show. It's a reminder. A reminder of what? Kevin asked, his curiosity genuine.
Margaret touched the medal gently, her fingers finding the familiar grooves and scratches that told their own story.
Of the people who didn't come home.
Of the boys, because they were mostly boys, who trusted me to get them to safety. Of promises made and kept, even when keeping them seemed impossible. The weight of her words settled over the nearby tables. Even Jessica seemed momentarily subdued, though her skepticism remained evident in her expression. Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out across the young woman's face, the collision between preconceived notions and emerging evidence that challenged those assumptions. "I still think this is suspicious," Jessica said finally, though her tone was less aggressive than before.
"I mean, if what you're saying is true, then you're what, a decorated war veteran? And you're just sitting here alone in a coffee shop like any other old lady?" Margaret almost smiled at the unintentional irony of the question.
That was exactly the point. She was like any other old lady, except for the extraordinary experiences that had shaped her youth. The assumption that military service somehow elevated a person above ordinary life revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what service meant to most veterans.
"Heroes grow old too," Margaret said softly.
"They buy groceries, pay bills, sit in coffee shops, and deal with arthritis like everyone else."
"The medal doesn't make me special.
It just means I did my job when it mattered most." Kevin carefully handed the discharge papers back to Margaret, treating them with obvious reverence.
"Ma'am, I want to apologize for not believing you right away. I've never met anyone like you before."
Margaret waved off his apology with a gentle smile. "There's nothing to apologize for, dear.
Healthy skepticism isn't a bad thing. And there are many people like me, more than you might think. We just don't usually advertise it."
As Margaret folded her papers and returned them to her wallet, she noticed a change in the atmosphere around her table. The casual dismissal had been replaced by something approaching respect, at least from some of the observers. But she could still feel the weight of Jessica's doubt, the young woman's inability to reconcile her assumptions with the evidence before her. The afternoon sun streamed through the coffee shop windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Margaret finished her tea and prepared to leave, as she did every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday afternoon. But today felt different somehow, charged with an energy she hadn't experienced in years. She stood slowly, her movements careful but dignified, and gathered her small purse. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a commotion near the front entrance. Several customers had turned to look, and she could hear the distinctive sound of military dress shoes on hardwood floors, a sharp, rhythmic clicking that spoke of years of training and discipline. Margaret glanced toward the entrance, expecting to see perhaps a young soldier on leave or a veteran meeting friends. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat and her heart skip a beat in recognition and disbelief. General Robert Harrison stood in the doorway of the coffee shop, his imposing figure immediately commanding attention. At 55, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer, shoulders squared, spine straight, every movement purposeful and precise. His dress uniform was immaculate, decorated with ribbons and insignia that spoke of decades of distinguished service. The 3 stars on his shoulders gleamed under the afternoon light, marking him as one of the highest-ranking officers in the region. The general's presence had an immediate effect on the coffee shop. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and customers found themselves unconsciously straightening in their chairs. Even those unfamiliar with military protocol could sense the authority that radiated from the man. Kevin, the young barista, stood frozen behind the counter, uncertain whether he should approach or maintain a respectful distance. General Harrison's eyes swept the room methodically, taking in every detail with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly and thoroughly. When his gaze fell upon Margaret Thompson, still standing beside her table near the window, his expression shifted noticeably. Recognition flickered across his features, followed by something that looked remarkably like awe. Margaret felt her knees weaken as she met the general's eyes.
She hadn't seen Robert Harrison in over 40 years, not since they were both young medics serving together in Vietnam.
Back then, he had been Sergeant Harrison, a dedicated and courageous soldier who had earned her respect through countless acts of bravery and compassion. She had heard through veteran networks that he had continued his military career, rising through the ranks with distinction, but she had never expected to encounter him here, in her quiet corner of the world. Jessica and Brad, still seated at their nearby table with Margaret's discharge papers having been returned, watched the unfolding scene with growing confusion. They had been so certain of their assessment of the elderly woman, so confident in their dismissal of her claims. Now, faced with the unexpected arrival of a high-ranking military officer whose attention was clearly focused on Margaret, they began to sense that they might have made a serious miscalculation. "Is that really her?" whispered a customer at the counter, recognizing the intensity of the moment but unsure of its significance. General Harrison moved through the coffee shop with measured steps, his path taking him directly toward Margaret's table. Other customers instinctively moved aside, creating a clear corridor between the general and the elderly woman. The clicking of his polished shoes on the hardwood floor seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet space, each step building tension and anticipation. As he approached, Margaret found herself transported back to that sweltering jungle hospital where she had first met Robert Harrison. He had been brought in with shrapnel wounds, conscious but in significant pain. She remembered the way he had insisted that other wounded soldiers be treated first, even as blood seeped through his field bandages. His selflessness and concern for his fellow soldiers had impressed her immediately, marking him as someone special even among the many brave individuals she encountered daily. "Sergeant Thompson," General Harrison said quietly as he came to a stop 3 feet from her table. His voice carried the same steady quality she remembered, though it now held the weight of decades of command responsibility. "Or should I say, Medic Thompson? It's been far too long." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. To hear her old rank spoken with such respect, by someone who had been there, who understood what it meant, it was overwhelming. "Bobby," she said softly, using the name she had known him by all those years ago. "I can't believe it's really you." The use of his old nickname seemed to soften the general's formal demeanor slightly. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, and, for a moment, the distinguished officer disappeared, replaced by the young sergeant she had once known. "You saved my life," he said simply. October 15, 1967, during the assault on Firebase Charlie. "Do you remember?" Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her medal, her fingers tracing its familiar surface as the memories came flooding back. That day had been one of the worst she had experienced during her entire service. The firebase had come under intense enemy attack, and casualties had been overwhelming. She had made multiple trips into the combat zone to evacuate wounded soldiers, each journey more dangerous than the last. "I remember," she said quietly. "You had taken shrapnel to your leg and shoulder. You kept trying to get up, insisted on helping carry others to safety even though you could barely walk yourself." General Harrison nodded, his expression growing more serious. "You came back for me when anyone else would have given up. The position was completely overrun, enemy fire was coming from 3 directions, and I was trapped under debris from a collapsed bunker. You spent 20 minutes digging me out while bullets flew overhead, then carried me 200 meters to the evacuation point." Jessica and Brad exchanged uncomfortable glances. The conversation unfolding before them was clearly authentic, filled with specific details and genuine emotion that would be impossible to fabricate. The general's obvious respect and gratitude toward Margaret was unmistakable, and it was becoming increasingly clear that they had been entirely wrong in their assessment of her. "You never came back for just me," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "There were 3 others trapped in that same position. I couldn't leave any of you behind." "For trips," General Harrison said firmly. "For separate trips into an active combat zone. You pulled out Corporal Davis first, then Private Johnson, then Specialist Kim, and, finally, me. By the time you reached me, the position was taking direct fire from multiple directions. Command had ordered the area abandoned as indefensible. Kevin, who had been listening intently from behind the counter, felt his breath catch. The story being recounted was far beyond anything he had imagined when he had first noticed Margaret's medal. This wasn't just military service, this was extraordinary heroism of the highest order. Margaret shook her head slightly.
I was just doing my job. Any medic would have done the same thing.
No, General Harrison said firmly.
Not any medic. What you did that day went far beyond duty.
You risked your life repeatedly to save others, against direct orders, in conditions that would have stopped most people cold. That's why you received the Bronze Star with V device for valor. The mention of the specific decoration caused a stir among the nearby customers. Even those unfamiliar with military awards knew that the Bronze Star was a significant honor, and the addition of the V device indicated that it had been earned through acts of bravery in combat. Suddenly, Margaret's tarnished medal took on an entirely different significance.
Jessica felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and shame.
The Bronze Star with V device, she had heard that term before, had read about it in articles about military heroes. She realized with growing horror that she had been mocking a genuine war hero, someone whose courage and sacrifice had saved multiple lives under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. I tried to find you after the war, General Harrison continued, his voice softer now. I wanted to thank you properly, to make sure you received the recognition you deserved. But women veterans often fell through the cracks in those days. Records were incomplete, addresses changed, and many of you just disappeared back into civilian life without any fanfare.
Margaret nodded sadly.
The experience he described was all too common among female veterans of that era. Unlike their male counterparts, women often returned home to find little acknowledgement of their service, few benefits, and a society that preferred to forget that women had served at all. Many had simply blended back into civilian life, their military experiences becoming private memories rather than public recognition. I tried to stay connected with some of the medical corps personnel, Margaret said.
But life gets in the way. Jobs, family, everyday responsibilities. And, honestly, not many people were interested in hearing war stories from a female medic. It was easier to just move on and try to build a normal life.
General Harrison's expression darkened slightly. That was a failure of our system, and I'm sorry for that. You and the other women who served deserved better. You deserved the same recognition, the same support, the same respect as any other veteran. The conversation had drawn the attention of most of the coffee shop's customers. Word was beginning to spread that something significant was happening, and several people had pulled out their phones, though they maintained a respectful distance. The weight of the moment was palpable, a chance encounter between two veterans, separated by decades but united by shared experience and mutual respect. Brad found his voice for the first time since the general's arrival. Sir, he said hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable but feeling compelled to speak.
We didn't know. We thought, we made assumptions.
General Harrison turned his attention to the young man, his expression neutral but assessing.
Assumptions about what, son?
About her, Brad said, nodding toward Margaret. About her medal, her service.
We thought it wasn't real.
The general's eyes hardened perceptibly.
You questioned this woman's service record?
Jessica spoke up, her voice small and filled with regret.
We did. I did.
I said terrible things about her medal, about her claims.
I accused her of making it up for attention.
She paused, struggling to find words for her shame.
I was wrong. Completely wrong.
Margaret watched the exchange with mixed feelings. Part of her felt vindicated to see her skeptics forced to confront their error, but she also felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. She had never wanted to make a scene or prove anyone wrong, she had just wanted to drink her tea in peace.
Ma'am, General Harrison said, turning back to Margaret, would you do me the honor of allowing me to buy you lunch?
I have so much I'd like to catch up on, so many questions about what you've been doing all these years. Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in years.
I'd like that very much, Bobby.
As they prepared to move to a quieter table, General Harrison paused and turned to address the coffee shop at large. His voice carried the authority of command, ensuring that everyone in the establishment could hear him clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want you all to know that you are in the presence of a genuine American hero. Medic Thompson saved my life and the lives of countless others during the Vietnam War. She served with distinction, courage, and honor that few of us could match. Her Bronze Star for valor was earned through repeated acts of extraordinary bravery under fire." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "I've spent 35 years in military service, and I've met many brave men and women. But I've never met anyone braver than Margaret Thompson. The medal she wears represents sacrifice, dedication, and heroism of the highest order. Anyone who questions that is questioning the judgment of the United States Army and the first-hand testimony of someone who was there." The coffee shop erupted in spontaneous applause. Customers rose from their seats, clapping enthusiastically, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe, respect, and shame for having initially overlooked or dismissed the elderly woman in their midst. Kevin led the applause from behind the counter, his eyes bright with admiration and new understanding. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, but also deeply moved. For decades, her service had gone unrecognized, her contributions forgotten by a society that had moved on from an unpopular war. To have her story acknowledged, her sacrifices validated in such a public way, was both humbling and healing. As the applause died down, General Harrison offered Margaret his arm in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. "Shall we find somewhere quieter to talk? I have a feeling we have a lot of catching up to do." Margaret accepted his arm gratefully, feeling steadier than she had in years. As they walked toward a more secluded table in the back of the coffee shop, she reflected on the unexpected turn her quiet afternoon had taken. Sometimes, she thought, the past had a way of catching up with you when you least expected it, bringing both vindication and closure to stories that had never been properly finished. As Margaret and General Harrison settled into a quiet corner booth away from the continuing buzz of conversation, she felt a strange mixture of emotions wash over her. The validation she had just experienced was overwhelming, but it also brought back memories she had carefully tucked away for decades. Across from her sat the living proof that her service had mattered, that the risks she had taken and the sacrifices she had made had real, lasting consequences. "I have to ask," General Harrison said as they waited for Kevin to bring fresh tea and coffee, "what have you been doing all these years? After you left the service, I mean." Margaret smiled ruefully. "Nothing nearly as exciting as what you've accomplished, I'm sure. I came back home in 1968, used my GI benefits to go to nursing school. Worked at the county hospital for 35 years, mostly in the emergency room. Retired about 10 years ago. Married? Children?" "Engaged once," Margaret said, her voice growing quieter. "To a wonderful man named Thomas. But he struggled with my war experience. He couldn't understand why I had nightmares, why loud noises made me jump, why I sometimes just needed to be alone. Back then, nobody talked about what we now call PTSD, especially not in women. I was expected to just come home and act like nothing had happened." General Harrison nodded grimly. "Those were different times. The support systems we have now for veterans, especially female veterans, just didn't exist. I'm sorry it didn't work out with Thomas." "Oh, it wasn't entirely the war that ended it," Margaret said with a sad smile. "Thomas was a good man, but he couldn't accept that I had seen and done things he couldn't imagine. He wanted me to be the same woman who had left for Vietnam, but that person didn't exist anymore. None of us came back as the same people we were when we left." Kevin approached their table carefully, balancing a tray with fresh tea for Margaret and black coffee for the general. His earlier casual friendliness had been replaced by obvious respect and a touch of nervousness at serving such distinguished company. "Ma'am, sir," he said quietly, "this is on the house. And I wanted to say, I'm sorry I doubted you earlier. My grandfather would be ashamed of me for not recognizing a fellow veteran immediately." Margaret reached out and gently touched Kevin's hand. "You have nothing to apologize for, dear. You were kind to me from the beginning, and that's what matters. Your grandfather would be proud of your good heart." As Kevin retreated, General Harrison continued their conversation. You mentioned nightmares.
Did you ever get help for that? Some, Margaret admitted. But not until much later, and not through the VA. Female veterans weren't really acknowledged by the Veterans Administration in those days.
We served, but we were often denied the same benefits and recognition as our male counterparts. I found help through a private therapist in the 1980s, paid for it myself. It helped, but some things never completely go away.
General Harrison's jaw tightened. That's unconscionable.
You served with the same dedication and faced the same dangers as any of us. The fact that you were denied proper support is a stain on our military's honor.
It wasn't unique to me, Margaret said philosophically. Most of the women I served with had similar experiences.
We learned to help each other when the official systems failed us. Some of us stayed in touch for years, sharing resources and support. But time and distance eventually scattered us to different lives. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Jessica and Brad, both looking deeply uncomfortable but determined. Jessica held Margaret's discharge papers, which she had apparently retrieved from their table.
"Excuse me," Jessica said hesitantly, "I know we don't have the right to interrupt, but I needed to return these to you."
She placed the folded documents carefully on the table.
"And I owe you an apology that goes far beyond just saying I'm sorry." Margaret looked up at the young woman, seeing genuine remorse in her expression.
"You don't owe me anything, dear.
We all make mistakes."
"No," Jessica said firmly, "this wasn't just a mistake. I was cruel, dismissive, and disrespectful. I made assumptions based on your age and appearance instead of listening to what you were telling me. I accused you of lying about military service that clearly cost you everything, your peace of mind, your relationship, your recognition. I was horrible to you, and I'm deeply ashamed."
General Harrison studied the young woman intently. "What made you change your mind?" Jessica glanced at Brad, who nodded encouragingly. "Honestly? At first it was just the evidence, seeing her papers, hearing your testimony, realizing we were completely wrong.
But then, I started thinking about why I was so quick to dismiss her in the first place." She paused, clearly struggling with her next words. "I realized I'd been taught to believe that heroes look a certain way, young, strong, confident, usually male. I couldn't see past her age and her modest circumstances to recognize what was right in front of me.
And that says something really ugly about me that I need to work on." Margaret felt a surprising wave of sympathy for the young woman.
"You're not the first person to make those assumptions, and you won't be the last.
The important thing is that you're willing to learn from it."
Brad stepped forward.
"Ma'am, I work in marketing, and I have some connections in local media. If you'd be willing, I think your story should be told."
Not for attention or anything like that, but because people need to understand that heroes live among us, often unrecognized. And maybe it would help other female veterans who have been ignored or forgotten."
General Harrison looked at Margaret questioningly. "That's entirely up to you, of course. But Brad has a point.
Your story could help shed light on the contributions of female veterans that have been overlooked for too long." Margaret considered the suggestion carefully. For decades, she had avoided attention, preferring to keep her experiences private. The idea of sharing her story publicly was both appealing and terrifying. On one hand, it might help other women veterans receive the recognition they deserved. On the other hand, it would mean opening up old wounds and exposing herself to potential criticism or disbelief.
"I'd need to think about it," she said finally. "It's not a decision I'd make lightly."
"Of course," Brad said quickly.
"No pressure at all.
But if you ever decide you want to share your story, I'd be honored to help you do it right." As Jessica and Brad returned to their table, General Harrison and Margaret continued their reunion. They talked about old friends, shared memories of their time in Vietnam, and caught up on the decades that had passed since they last saw each other. Margaret learned that the general had served tours in multiple conflicts, had been wounded twice more after Vietnam, and had dedicated his career to improving conditions and opportunities for all service members, with particular attention to addressing the inequities faced by women and minorities in the military.
I've thought about you often over the years, General Harrison admitted. Not just because you saved my life, but because of what you represented. You were one of the first people who showed me that courage isn't about size or gender or traditional expectations. You taught me that heroism comes in all forms, and that lesson shaped my entire career. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes again. To learn that her actions had had such a profound impact on someone's life was deeply moving. I just did what needed to be done. Anyone would have done the same thing.
No, General Harrison said firmly, anyone would not have done the same thing. Most people would have followed orders and stayed in the secure area.
Most people would have accepted that some casualties were unavoidable.
You made a conscious choice to risk your own life repeatedly to save others, against orders, under conditions that terrified even seasoned combat veterans.
That's not normal behavior, that's exceptional behavior.
Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several more customers who had apparently heard about what was happening at the coffee shop. Word had spread through social media and text messages about the elderly woman with the Bronze Star and the general who had saluted her. Among the new arrivals, Margaret noticed several people wearing veteran ball caps and military t-shirts.
An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran cap approached their table cautiously.
"Excuse me, ma'am," he said to Margaret, "I heard you served with the Medical Corps in Vietnam." "I was with the 1st Infantry Division, 1966 to 1967.
I wanted to thank you for what you and the other medics did for us. You folks saved a lot of lives over there." Margaret smiled warmly at the veteran. "What's your name, soldier?" "Jim Peterson, ma'am."
"I was wounded near Saigon in early '67, treated by a female medic who probably saved my leg, maybe my life. I never got her name, never had a chance to thank her properly. When I heard about what happened here today, I had to come and pay my respects." "Well, Jim Peterson," Margaret said, "consider yourself thanked on behalf of all of us who served in the Medical Corps. We were honored to take care of brave soldiers like you."
General Harrison watched this exchange with obvious satisfaction. "You see what's happening here," he said to Margaret. "Your presence, your story, is bringing people together.
It's giving other veterans a chance to connect with their experiences and find some closure." More veterans continued to arrive throughout the evening, each with their own story to share, their own thanks to offer. The coffee shop had transformed from a simple afternoon gathering place into an impromptu veterans reunion. Margaret found herself at the center of it all, listening to stories, sharing memories, and providing the kind of recognition and validation that many of these veterans had been seeking for decades. Kevin and the coffee shop staff worked overtime to accommodate the growing crowd, providing free coffee and snacks to the veterans while maintaining a respectful atmosphere. The young barista seemed transformed by the experience, asking questions about military service and showing genuine interest in the stories being shared. As the evening wore on, Margaret realized that something profound was happening. The simple act of wearing her medal and being recognized for her service had created a ripple effect, bringing healing and closure to multiple people. Veterans who had felt forgotten were remembering that their service mattered.
Young people were learning about sacrifices made on their behalf.
And she herself was experiencing a sense of vindication and peace that had eluded her for decades. "You know," General Harrison said quietly as they watched the interactions around them, "I think this is exactly what needed to happen.
Not just for you, but for all of us.
We've been carrying these stories alone for too long, thinking nobody cared or understood. Tonight proved that people do care, they just needed someone to show them how." Margaret nodded, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since her military service. Maybe Brad was right about sharing the story more widely. If this small gathering can have such an impact, imagine what a larger platform might accomplish.
"Whatever you decide," General Harrison said, "know that you'll have my full support."
It's time the world knew about heroes like Margaret Thompson, and it's past time that female veterans received the recognition they've always deserved. As the impromptu gathering continued around them, Margaret felt something shift inside her. For years, she had carried the weight of her experiences alone, believing that her service was in the past and no longer relevant. Tonight had shown her that her story still had power, still had the ability to inspire and heal. Perhaps it was time to step out of the shadows and claim her place in history, not for personal glory, but for all the women who had served alongside her and deserved to be remembered. 6 months after that transformative afternoon in the coffee shop, Margaret Thompson stood before a packed auditorium at the local Veterans Center. The room was filled with active duty military personnel, veterans from multiple conflicts, high school students participating in a history project, and community members who had heard about the remarkable woman whose story had begun to spread throughout the region. Margaret wore her best dress, the same navy blue outfit she reserved for special occasions, and her Bronze Star medal gleamed prominently on her chest. But tonight, it wasn't tarnished or overlooked. Tonight, it commanded the respect and recognition it had always deserved. Beside her on the stage sat General Harrison, who had become not just a friend but an advocate for her story and the stories of other forgotten female veterans. The events that had led to this moment seemed almost surreal to Margaret. After that evening in the coffee shop, Brad had been true to his word, working with local media to share her story with sensitivity and respect. The initial article in the county newspaper had been picked up by regional outlets, then national veterans publications, and, finally, by major news networks. But, more importantly, it had sparked a movement to recognize and honor the contributions of female veterans who had been overlooked for decades. When I first put on this medal 60 years ago, Margaret began, her voice clear and strong despite her age, I never imagined I would be standing here today, sharing my story with all of you. For most of my life, I believed my service was something private, something to be carried quietly and remembered personally. I was wrong. In the front row sat Jessica and Brad, both of whom had become unexpected allies in Margaret's journey. Jessica had taken a leave of absence from her marketing job to volunteer with veterans organizations, dedicating herself to helping identify and support female veterans who had been forgotten by the system. Brad had used his professional skills to help establish a foundation dedicated to preserving the stories of women in military service. I want to tell you about a day in October 1967, Margaret continued, not because it was the most important day of my life, but because it was a day that showed me what we're all capable of when we choose to serve something greater than ourselves. She went on to describe the events at Firebase Charlie, but not in the way she had recounted them to General Harrison. This time, she focused not on her own actions but on the courage of the wounded soldiers who had trusted her to get them to safety, the medics who had worked alongside her under impossible conditions, and the commanders who had made difficult decisions in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. People have called me a hero because of what happened that day, Margaret said, her eyes scanning the audience. But I want you to understand something important. Heroism isn't about being special or different. It's about making a choice to act when action is needed, even when you're scared, even when the outcome is uncertain. In the audience, Kevin from the coffee shop sat with his grandfather, a Korean War veteran who had rarely spoken about his own service until meeting Margaret. The elderly man had tears in his eyes as he listened to her story, finally, understanding that his own quiet sacrifice and service had been meaningful and worthy of recognition. Margaret's speech continued for another 20 minutes, weaving together personal anecdotes with broader themes about service, sacrifice, and the importance of recognizing all who serve their country. But the most powerful moment came when she invited other female veterans in the audience to stand and be recognized. Slowly, women throughout the auditorium rose to their feet. Some were elderly, their service dating back to World War II and Korea. Others were middle-aged veterans of more recent conflicts. A few were young women who had recently completed their military service. As they stood, the audience erupted in sustained applause, many people realizing for the first time how many women had served in uniform throughout American history. These women, Margaret said, gesturing to those standing, represent millions of others who have served with distinction and courage. They have been nurses and medics, pilots and mechanics, intelligence analysts and communications specialists. They have served in every major conflict of the past century, and they have done so with honor, dedication, and often without recognition. General Harrison took the podium next, announcing the establishment of the Margaret Thompson Foundation for Female Veterans Recognition. The foundation, funded through donations that had poured in after her story became public, would work to identify forgotten female veterans and ensure they received the benefits and recognition they had earned. Margaret Thompson's story is remarkable not because she is unique, General Harrison said, but because she represents thousands of women whose stories have never been told. Our goal is to change that, to ensure that no female veteran ever again has to sit alone in a coffee shop while people question her service and mock her sacrifice. Following the ceremony, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers, fellow veterans, and young people eager to hear more about her experiences. But the encounter that moved her most was with a teenage girl named Sarah, whose grandmother had served as a nurse in Vietnam but had never spoken about her experiences. "My grandmother has a medal too," Sarah said quietly, "but she keeps it hidden in a drawer. She says nobody would be interested in her story because she just took care of wounded soldiers."
After hearing you tonight, I understand how wrong that is. Will you help me convince her to share her story? Margaret smiled warmly at the young woman. I'd be honored to meet your grandmother.
"And you tell her that Margaret Thompson said there's no such thing as just taking care of wounded soldiers.
That's the most important job anyone can do."
As the evening wound down, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple afternoon tea in a coffee shop. The mockery and dismissal she had experienced from Jessica and Brad had hurt at the time, but it had also been the catalyst for everything that followed. Sometimes, she realized, the most painful experiences could lead to the most meaningful outcomes. The foundation had already begun its work, helping to identify and support female veterans who had been overlooked by traditional veterans services. They had established a scholarship program for young women pursuing military careers, created an oral history project to preserve the stories of female veterans, and worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs to improve services and recognition for women who had served. But, perhaps most importantly, Margaret had discovered that her story still had power. The young barista Kevin had enlisted in the National Guard, inspired by the veterans he had met in his coffee shop. Jessica had found new purpose in her work with veterans organizations. Brad had shifted his career focus to nonprofit work, using his skills to help other worthy causes gain attention and support. The local high school had implemented a new curriculum unit on women in military service, ensuring that future generations would learn about the contributions of female veterans. The coffee shop where it all began had become an informal gathering place for veterans, with Kevin organizing regular meetups and Kevin's grandfather sharing his own war stories for the first time in decades. General Harrison had been promoted and was now overseeing military programs designed to improve gender equality and recognition within the armed forces. He credited his encounter with Margaret as a reminder of unfinished business that needed to be addressed, promises that needed to be kept to those who had served their country with distinction. Margaret's own life had been transformed as well. No longer was she a forgotten veteran living quietly on the margins of society. She had become a sought-after speaker, an advocate for female veterans, and a symbol of the courage and dedication that define military service regardless of gender. But, perhaps most importantly, she had found peace with her past and purpose for her future. The bronze medal on her chest, once tarnished and overlooked, now gleamed with the recognition and respect it had always deserved. But Margaret understood that the medal itself was not the point. The real treasure was the connection she had made, the lives she had touched, and the knowledge that her service, both past and present, continued to make a difference in the world. As she prepared to leave the Veterans Center that evening, surrounded by new friends and old comrades, Margaret thought about the young woman she had been all those years ago in the jungles of Vietnam. That frightened but determined medic could never have imagined the life that lay ahead, the decades of quiet service that would follow, or the unexpected recognition that would come at the end. But she would have understood the most important lesson of all, that true service never really ends. It simply changes form, finding new ways to heal, to help, and to honor those who need it most. The medal on Margaret's chest would always remind her of the young soldiers she had saved in Vietnam, but it also represented something larger, the ongoing commitment to serve others that had defined her entire life. The coffee shop incident had taught her that heroism isn't always recognized when it happens, and that recognition, when it finally comes, can be more powerful and meaningful than anyone expects. But, most importantly, it had shown her that every person has the potential to make a difference, to serve something greater than themselves, and to be a hero in their own unique way. As Margaret Thompson walked out into the evening air, her bronze medal catching the light from the street lamps, she carried with her not just the weight of her own story, but the stories of all the women who had served alongside her.
They would not be forgotten again.
Their sacrifices would be remembered, their courage would be celebrated, and their service would finally receive the honor it had always deserved. The general salute in that coffee shop had been more than a gesture of respect between old comrades. It had been a recognition of worth, a validation of sacrifice, and a promise that the debt owed to forgotten heroes would finally be paid. And, in that recognition, Margaret had found not just personal vindication, but the inspiration to ensure that no veteran would ever again have to face mockery and dismissal when their story deserved honor and remembrance.